Most of us have undoubtedly had the experience of sitting in a terminal building at some point and gazing out into really bad weather outside, wishing that things would clear up before the departure of your aircraft. While flying in severe weather is never comfortable, it usually becomes considerably better when the weather clears. However, what occurs if the turbulent weather you're flying in doesn't go away and instead follows your plane, not allowing the pilots to land? Pay attention. Pattering rain. Maintain a backup at all times. The Singapore Airlines staff was gathered in their crew buses that evening on October 25, 2022. Arriving at Heathrow Airport in London, they intended to run a straight trip for 13 hours. Heading for Singapore Changi Airport, and as Singapore is 8 hours ahead of the UK, their timing was ideal, resulting in an extremely early start, but they would also return home in the early afternoon. The pilot's dispatcher gave them a briefing pack with the weather when they got to the airport, NOTAMs, flight schedules, and other pertinent documents, which they began meticulously going over. For the most part, the weather on the way appeared to be fine. There were no significant weather systems that may create problems, although the weather upon arrival in Singapore appeared to be in danger of afternoon thunderstorm activity. However, the prognosis also indicated that the storms would only last temporarily and the visibility would be good, so the pilots weren't very concerned. Was anticipated to remain higher than the landing minimum even in the shower. Likewise, this applied to their intended substitutes. Storms were also predicted for Senai International Airport, Kuala Lumpur International Airport, and Paya Lebar Air Base. Yet they continued to function as backups. The current weather calls for a constant backup plan. Should be somewhat better than the destination's anticipated weather in order to ensure that crews can land safely. Even if the destination's weather turns out to be worse than anticipated, thunderstorms are renowned for being unpredictable. Recall that. In any case, the pilots were aware that backup fuel was included in their planned flight path. Starting the fuel. Depending on historical statistics, this is often either 3% or 5% of the trip fuel, and that gasoline is meant to be used for unforeseen detours encountered while cruising. That may add up to many tons on lengthy trips like this one. Of more fuel, they also knew that they would almost always be able to take detours around European airspace, which would also save them a good deal of gasoline. Taking all of it into consideration, the pilots approved the 106,164 kilograms flight plan fuel without adding anything more, and they went on to give their cabin staff a briefing as they prepared to step outside to the plane. The 55-year-old captain of the flight had flown over 13,400 hours in total. Although he had previously operated the 747, he had an amazing 10,075 hours on the 777, indicating his high level of experience. On this flight, he had been matched with someone, with a first officer who is 31 years old and has flown the 777 for more than 2,200 hours despite having far less experience. They spoke about who would be piloting and concluded that it was the first officer's turn as they were making their way outside to the plane, and the pilot would be under the captain's supervision. The Boeing 777-300ER, or extended range, was the aircraft to which they had been allocated. Equipped with two enormous General Electric GE90-115B turbofan engines. There were no known mechanical issues with this stunning machine throughout the trip. The first officer readied the aircraft for departure while the captain checked the tech log and technical condition and conducted a walk-around. And the 280 passengers who were supposed to fly were boarded by the cabin staff. After everything went according to plan, they finally retreated. Approximately on time, the aircraft began rolling down Heathrow's runway 27 right for takeoff at 20:06. The takeoff and cruise went as planned, passing through European airspace and finding many detours, indicating that the plane was about 30 minutes ahead of schedule as it began to approach its destination, and loaded up with lots of petrol. Getting close to Singapore, the pilots were notified by Singapore Approach Control that an ILS approach was likely as they approached Kuala Lumpur IFR. Into runway 20 right, causing the first officer to begin preparations before briefing the captain for the approach protocol and anticipated arrival. During that briefing, they talked about a gasoline crisis, which seemed okay at the moment. As previously said, they intended to land around 30 minutes early or at 16:23 local time, and with around 7 tons of gasoline left in reserve. 3,024 kilograms of gasoline was their last reserve, and it was clear that they were well above that. This is definitely a good opportunity to go over some guidelines for how much gasoline we pilots must carry, particularly in case of an unforeseen circumstance. The pilot is always responsible for ensuring that there is sufficient fuel to complete the flight in a safe manner and arrive with more petrol than the last reserve. In other words, the 3,024 kilograms. A final reserve in this instance should always be safeguarded and should never be touched under normal conditions. Thus, in addition to checking the flight plan prior to takeoff, we also need to confirm the presence of the following fuel at minimum. We require trip fuel, which is the quantity of gasoline needed for the amount of fuel used for the in- and out-of-cab rides. Hence, in addition to the previously indicated contingency fuel, we actually need to fly the airplane to the location before landing. Relating to unanticipated events while traveling, which is equivalent to 3% or 5% of the total gasoline used. Additionally, in the event of known delays, the pilots have the option to add any additional fuel they would like to carry. For instance, fog or thunderstorms. Thus, it is the fuel we require in order to reach our target, but in addition to that, we also need. This is referred to as alternate fuel, which includes the gasoline required to carry out a climb, cruise, and descent after a missed approach at the destination. Heading in the direction of the other airport, then making an approach and landing there. Lastly, overall else. Additionally, we require the last reserve gasoline, which I previously stated should never be touched. In typical conditions and should be sufficient to maintain the aircraft's height of 1,500 feet above the alternative airport for at least half an hour. The legal minimum that each commercial flight must now meet is this. Must always carry, and this computation has a significant amount of cushion built in, as you can see. For this reason, when you learn that the pilots are using the least amount of gasoline, you shouldn't hold your breath. Because, assuming there are no major interruptions that the firm or we anticipate, that is what we should be taking. In reality, consuming more gasoline than this would just increase fuel consumption, which will be expensive for the airline, and a greater influence on the environment. Anyway, you also need to grasp some of the phraseology we employ in order to comprehend what's going to happen. Keep in mind, air traffic control and pilots about low fuel occurrences and our thought processes in handling such kinds of scenarios. When an airplane is approaching its destination and an unexpected runway change or other event occurs. Subsequently, the pilots will often be placed in a holding pattern. These are patterns created by racetracks. They are often built around a navigational aid or RNAV waypoint and are there to help air traffic controllers to sufficiently space out incoming planes and slow down the flow of traffic. When flying in the hold, the aircraft would be given a certain altitude to stay at, and if further aircraft arrived after them, they will then be allocated to greater elevations. Additionally, the aircraft that is lowest in the stack drops with everyone else in the hold will ultimately be directed toward the method. Now, in the event that an unforeseen stay was imposed, the pilots, their flight management computers will get the hold, and since it is already aware of the alternative fuel, the computer will display the maximum amount of time they may be in hold before having to choose to either divert to their alternate or pledge allegiance to the goal. Normally, once we are aware of that time, we will contact air traffic control for an anticipated arrival time, and depending on that, we may make our decision. In most cases, this is rather simple if, for instance, because of a straightforward runway change and the favorable weather, there's a fair chance that the aircraft will be able to touch down at our intended location, and we can gladly begin utilizing the backup fuel to remain in the hold. That is, of course, if we can see that the wait time is not too great and will get us very near to the last reserve. However, should we see that the delay is probably going to be longer than that, or that the reason for the delay is it is unpredictable, so we have no idea how long it will take. As a result, we must begin making plans for a distraction and inform air traffic control of our plans as soon as we can so they can begin to plan. This is really significant, and I'll explain why later. During our investigation into the flight for this episode, my colleagues and I came across a number of restricted websites and geo-restricted information, primarily articles from newspapers. What then did we do? What I haven't yet discussed is what pilots must report to air traffic control in the event that a fuel crisis arises. To decline. Let's take a scenario where we are expecting to be approached at a certain moment and we are sitting in the area. It will need us to utilize our alternative fuel, but there is still a significant amount of cushion until we reach our ultimate reserve. And everything else appears to be in order. If that's the case, we may just wait in the holding till our approach occurs. Notifying ATC of our commitment to the target airport is not required. However, let's assume that we begin. Obtaining approach vectors, air traffic control abruptly informs us that they will have to allow us 5 more minutes of extended vectors before we land, in case there is a fresh problem. Looking down at our FMC now, we can see that the additional 5 minutes of delay. There is now just one runway available for us to land on, and any further delays would imply that we could have to begin utilizing the fuel from our last reserve. If so, we must declare the minimal gasoline to the air traffic controller. Although this call is not intended for an emergency, it is intended to alert air traffic control that a fuel emergency will result from any additional delay. No priority will be facilitated by this kind of call. Actually, this is only a polite reminder to sharpen the controller's situational awareness. We can now see that this will happen if there is any more delay after this. Now lead us to land with less than the ultimate reserve, in this instance, less than 3,024 kilograms. At that point, we would have to declare, Mayday, 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 low fuel. It would be the last thing this flight would be regarded as a full-fledged emergency flight, which entails using every runway that is available and receiving first priority. Even military ones will become available for their usage, although it's important to stress that these calls must comply with regulations. This can occur to any aircraft that is experiencing delays of any length, such as diversions above and above what they had anticipated. These calls need to be placed, and while they are obviously serious, it does not imply that the corporation, the pilots, or the aircraft are about to crash out of the sky. Not inherently committed any wrongdoing. One of the most misinterpreted situations is most likely a fuel emergency. In the aviation industry, particularly by the media, but you guys are now more informed. The aircraft started to descend as it approached Singapore, and at 8:05. The controller phoned them as they were dropping through 15,000 feet to inform them that they would need to enter a holding over a waypoint known as Paspu, due to a growing tailwind on runway 20 right, where they were supposed to arrive. Every aircraft wants to attempt taking off and landing in a headwind. Furthermore, a tailwind of more than 10 knots is often not allowed. As a result, the operational runway may need to be adjusted. When that occurs, all of the aircraft that were being directed to land on that runway will need to be diverted to the opposing runway, which may cause the aircraft in line to wait a long period. The cause of the wind shift, though, was what made this situation so fascinating. When the plane got into the hold, upon examining his weather radar, the captain observed substantial rainfall and thunderstorm activity above Singapore Airport. Additionally, the region extended all the way to the northwest shore. This region of storm cells appears to encompass. Their options for what to do in the event of a diversion were limited by their planned substitutes, Sinai International and Paya Lebar Air Base. As you may recall, Kuala Lumpur was another option, although it was considerably farther away, and would consequently require an almost instantaneous diversion. The skipper then began searching for alternative options. He saw that another airport, known as Hang Nadim or Batam Airport, was located nearly directly to the south of Singapore and appeared to be storm-free, and was quite nearby as well. If he were to designate that as his backup, he would have more time to spend in the hold, which would ideally allow them to land in Singapore, their intended destination, instead. This is precisely how pilots operate, continuously searching for solutions that are both operationally sound and efficient. Address any potential issues that may surface. The aircraft made it through one full hold over Paspu. They were then informed that 02 left was now the arrival runway in Singapore. In the meanwhile, the flight was turned over to the captain by the first officer so he could prepare and rebrief for this new approach to the arrival controller for Singapore, who began directing them with radar to runway 02 left. The weather down below was rapidly becoming worse, with strong rain and erratic gusts. The wind was literally being pushed out of the base of this massive thunderstorm, changing direction by 180 degrees. It was hovering over the airport. As Flight 319 approached, these variations in wind forced 2 other planes to circle about. Due to heavy rain, the runway's visibility was only 500 meters at 1627. And the airport chose to halt arrivals until the weather cleared up due to the severe circumstances. As Flight 319 had now elapsed over the scheduled time for landing, they were beginning to deplete the gasoline below the intended 7 tons and getting closer to their last stockpile. Now, the final report lacked a great deal of detail. Regarding the precise numbers, a Boeing 737-300ER will burn between 100 and 130 kilograms per minute. I'm not claiming that this is what was occurring in this instance, though. We have no idea what's going to happen, but will undoubtedly produce a great deal of concern because we are still far away from this story's conclusion. At around 1700 hours, the airplane began its descent along the VOR approach, avoiding storms. The approach controller advised the crew that there was now a 14 degrees tailwind, gusts reaching up to 30 knots for runway 22. The 777 was approved to fly at a maximum tailwind of 15 knots, and no more than 10 were approved by Singapore Airlines. Given the observed wind at this time, they were capable of facing gusts of up to 30 knots straight up their tail, which was far higher than what would be deemed safe. Therefore, the team chose to ascend to 1,800 feet rather than continuing with the approach at about 1,600 feet. Should attempt to move in the opposite direction for the ILS approach. Everywhere there were storm cells. Thus, the pilot made a wide left turn after flying just north of the center line, in an attempt to self-maneuver toward the ILS approach center line. Recall that this was now a serious emergency, and the skipper was undoubtedly well aware that the fuel in the tanks was running low. Following the announcement of the low fuel amount alert, the crew had to follow additional protocols. Required consideration. A QRH non-normal checklist was part of that, and it basically said that they would require to land with a maximum of 20 flaps rather than 30, and that they should refrain from braking quickly after landing, to prevent the fuel pumps within the tanks from being exposed. Why is the flap setting lower? Was to activate a flare in the event of a dual-engine flameout, as Boeing had discovered from a 2008 dual flameout event involving a British Airways 777 that had landed short of the runway at Heathrow. By the way, we've previously talked about this occurrence on the channel. What this lower flap setting does would require a greater landing distance and a little faster landing speed, but Batham's runway was long enough. Then there would be no issue with it. When the aircraft was only around 6 nautical miles from the airport, the turn to the left began, which, should you choose to intercept an ILS approach, is quite near. The skipper was probably avoiding the weather here, as I said before, and it's probable that he closed the circuit to prevent a bigger cell from forming on the middle line. However, it's also likely that all he wanted was to snoop on the approach and make a quick landing, due to the fuel's condition. Now he was going to employ the autopilot's autoland function to ensure a safe touchdown. Nonetheless, in order to use this feature, the autopilot must be in a favorable position and over 600 feet. And steady approach to function, as well as what these two pilots were now flying, was quite dissimilar from an ILS pattern. When the airplane made a wide left turn, at a height of just around 1,000 feet, had gone through the center line and was now descending to attempt to intercept the ILS, and 2 nautical miles or less from the runway. I have already described the operation of the ILS system in previous videos. Nonetheless, to put it briefly, there are 2 antennae on the ground outside and beyond the runway. They each produce 2 sets of radio waves. The airplane receives direction in the horizontal plane via the localizer antenna, and the vertical plane's glide slope antenna. At this point, when these signals leave the antennas, they radiate outward. As they move farther from the antennae, the signals become broader and wider. As a result, the aircraft's equipment that interpret these signals will becoming increasingly sensitive. The airplane gets nearer to the antennas. For this reason, it is quite crucial to early intercept the ILS, often at least 5 nautical miles away, such that the aircraft to position itself so that, when it approaches the runway, it only needs to make small adjustments to its pitch and roll. However, as I just mentioned, this plane was now attempting to intercept the ILS far closer than that, and the skipper was doing so while maintaining a vertical speed of 1,300 feet per minute in addition to a comparatively high intercept angle of about 15 degrees. Runway visible. The first officer notified the approach controller that they could now see the runway at 17:05. Despite the heavy downpour. At this moment, they were moving at an altitude of around 1,200 feet. And the pilot continued to manually maneuver the aircraft in an attempt to match it up with the center line. The crew was instructed by the approach controller to switch to Batham Tower for landing clearance, and this instruction was read back. However, the transition was never made. Almost simultaneously with this call, the captain who had earlier activated the approach mode noticed that he had now successfully caught the glide slope and localizer, which led him to activate the autopilot once again in preparation for the planned autoland. But very quickly, he saw that the ILS indication was displaying as well as a no autoland warning on his primary flight display. That the plane was now operating at full size above the middle line and to the left of it. Although it made perfect logic, the captain was rather perplexed by this. Considering that he had tried to intercept the ILS so near to the runway while maintaining rather wide intercept angles, there was just not enough time for the autopilot to get the aircraft into a more stable position. Rather, it kept falling, attempting to turn around but having little to no time to do so. Now, in the tower controller was phoning the approach controller to let him know that he had not received any word from the emergency plane that was arriving and that no permission had been granted to land. Furthermore, he did not make any eye contact with the traffic because the intense rain had now reduced visibility to 500 meters. 20 seconds following the appearance of the no autoland notification, the captain made the decision to circle around and flip the TO/GA switches when just 132 feet above the ground. The airplane began to ascend away from the runway as the two engines blasted into go-around thrust, now depleting even more of the limited amount of gasoline they still had in the tanks. Although we can never be certain, a 777 would typically require about 1,500 kilograms throughout a typical round. Now, this was their second attempt, although their initial one was from a comparatively high altitude and probably had the flaps adjusted lower when the airplane ascended to 3,000 feet. It was 17:09, 46 minutes after they were supposed to land with 7 tons. Therefore, 2,000 kilograms or so would be an approximate estimate of the fuel on board at this stage. And perhaps not even that much. The captain requested an updated assessment of the wind and visibility from the approach controller. Insufficient fuel for runway 22, as that runway was now closer to them, but in order to obtain this information, the approach controller had to ask the tower. He responded after around 90 seconds, and in that time, the airplane had made a turn and continued flying downwind for a second ILS approach. Finally, runway 04 reported 500 meters of visibility, while runway 22 recorded 6 kilometers. Indicating that a strong shower was currently passing over the field, while the wind was still constant at 340 degrees and 7 mph. In response to the information, the captain stated that they were out of fuel to relocate for runway 22 from their current location. So even though the visibility was terrible, he would proceed for another ILS into runway 04 since they had to land this time. Additionally, he had been flying a downwind that was getting him closer and closer to the center line for an unknown cause, most likely the weather. As he began his last right turn, he was once more just 5.5 nautical miles away from the runway, traveling at a speed of 220 knots while remaining at 3,000 feet. This meant that he would now need to descend quickly while setting up the aircraft in order to grab the ILS and turning in a pear-shaped curve to the right. It's rather difficult to predict what the weather radar appeared to be full of really awful red returns in the cockpit at this time, but if we are to learn anything, the lesson to be learned from this circumstance is to do things slowly and give yourself more time even if it seems like you have less time. Had this crew been able to extend the downwind on their prior approach, there's a good chance they should have been taxiing in by now to intercept the ILS farther out, but instead they were going to create an even more intricate circuit. 1711 is the moment the approach controller notified the crew that they were cleared to approach runway 04 and that the visibility had now increased to 800 meters. According to their own judgment. Once more using the radios, the captain said that his purpose was to proceed for runway 04 as they had spoken upon before. As I have stated, in a high-stress setting, the captain ought to have made a constant effort to enlist the assistance of the whole crew. And part of that would have undoubtedly involved giving the first officer control over the radio, but that was not the case in this instance. In the meantime, the tower controller had cleared the runway vicinity of any objects to ensure that the aircraft may land this time without any issues. The pilot requested that the aircraft be configured to only have 20 flaps. He once more attempted to intercept the last at a distance of around 2 miles, only to find himself in essentially the same spot. He was intercepting from the left this time though. When the plane did eventually emerge from the clouds, the two pilots saw that they were somewhat skewed to the left and far above the glide slope. The pilot made an attempt to manually guide the aircraft into the landing slot, but doing so required him to descend more than 1,400 feet per minute. It caused a sink rate at such low altitude. Pace of sinking. Warning of ground closeness. And it resulted in the unimaginable, a third orbit, which occurred at precisely 1714 from a mere height of 212 feet. Critical fuel. Now, the aircraft ascended at a vertical speed of around 4,300 feet per minute, like a rocket. However, they immediately leveled off at 2,000 feet. The approach controller was called by the captain. He advised him that he intended to continue flying straight ahead because the fuel was now critically low. And since there wasn't any more fuel left, they had to land on runway 22 using a visual teardrop technique. And given that the gasoline on board would have likely been less than 1,000 kilograms at this stage, he was probably correct in his assessment. They were told by the approach controller that there was a tailwind of around 6 knots and that the wind was now 330 degrees at 15 knots, which the captain accepted with pleasure. For the fourth approach, the crew swiftly changed the aircraft's configuration. Fortunately, the terrible weather had now shifted far further south. The airplane ultimately made a safe landing at 1719. On runway 22, with a fuel level much below the final reserve. We will never be able to determine the exact gasoline level now, however, as I previously mentioned, using very basic and cautious fuel estimates reveals that the weight may have been far less than 1,000 kilograms, which is a landing fuel that even I, as a pilot of a Boeing 737, get cold sweats. The incident occurred because of bad weather and the pilot's desire to arrive at their target airport, according to the final report, instead of changing course early. Remarkably, this is the only article I've ever seen that provides a direct reference to the effects of climate change and the storms that are becoming more powerful as a result, which is also influencing the pilot's judgment. This incident was integrated into Singapore Airlines pilot training programs in a number of ways, and that, along with improved briefing materials and more focus on fuel planning, was